Hi, thank you guys for coming out and trying to find parking. And Chuck gave me a little bit of history of this series and this church. And there's a lot of activist energy in this church going back 150 years. So it feels really, really great to discuss these issues here. And I want to thank the activists in the audience who are, who've made Boston one of the centers of the living wage struggle. So that's me very quickly.
And I am also very, very honored to be in this beautiful space and to see my work. And there are some note cards to try to give you some context, a little bit of the stories of these people. I wanted, to whatever extent possible, you to understand a little bit about these images. And we'll talk more as we get on. Thank you so much.
So I guess the first note I wanted to start on was personal, which is our collaboration. Liz beat me in the 7th grade spelling bee, but she didn't want to get up on stage, so I got to get up on stage, and we have been passing the mic ever since. And we grew up in Brighton Beach, Brooklyn, which was a neighborhood that it had long been a center of radical activism, and it became a center of Soviet Jewish immigration in the 1970s, after it had been a place where Holocaust survivors lived, and a union stronghold for union retirees in the garment trades, and a place where they sang revolutionary songs on the boardwalk at night and all that. So we began our work, when?
Well, do I really have to say this? Okay, I think we met in 1971.
No, but
okay. And then in 1980, we were students at the Evergreen State College in Olympia, Washington, another hotbed of radicalism and creativity as well. And I was at that point very turned on by documentary photography, particularly. Less of it is in a beautiful place in the Pacific Northwest, and I didn't take any pictures of trees, but I did take pictures of subcultures that I found in and around Olympia. And Annelise and I, at that point in 1980, applied for an NEH grant. And we got a grant, and we did an oral history of our neighborhood in Brighton Beach, which resulted in a book called The Soviet Jewish Americans. And I am back at home now scanning negatives. When I'm not doing this and other things, I'm scanning lots and lots and lots and lots of old black and white negatives that I processed in my kitchen. There will be more work coming out of that. You'll see lots more pictures of that time in Brighton.
So this project had a couple of places that it started. It started really on March 25th, 2011, which was the 100th anniversary of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. And we were organizing 100th anniversary commemorations in New York City. And I was very aware, and many of us who do labor history were aware, that the narrative was one of, that was the bad old days, something really horrible happened, but it changed American labor law, which it did, and now 100 years later we can look back and say we need to remain vigilant, but everything's better. And very quickly it became clear that that was certainly not the case. In the age of global capitalism, there was a race to the bottom, and things were quite bad for many workers. So we invited people who worked in today's most dangerous trades. We invited taxi drivers, coal miners, catfish workers, and also garment workers. And at that event, Kalpona Akhtar, then 37, who organizes garment workers, the women who make our clothes in Bangladesh, walked up on the stage in the Great Hall of the People in Cooper Union in New York City, which is another venerable activist space, where 100 years earlier, a great uprising of garment workers, which was called the Uprising of the 20,000, started. It was the biggest women's strike to that time. And she got up on the stage and she echoed the words that Clara Lemlich-Shavelson, then a 23-year-old garment worker in 1909, said. She said, "I have something to say." And what she said was this. She said, in Bangladesh, it's not 2011, it's 1911. And what happened, I became intrigued by that phrase. And this book, in some senses, Liz and my traveling around the world to interview today's workers, This book, in some senses, is pursuing the truth of that line. And what we found out is that it's not just 1911 in Bangladesh. It's 1911 in Providence. It's 1911 in the Bronx. It's 1911 in Oxnard, California. That the rights that workers fought for 100 years ago and that were won, you know, through the first third of the 20th century, not just in the US, but in many other parts of the world, have been eroded in the age of global capitalism. So that line was one beginning for this book. There was a second beginning for this book that gave the book its title. It was also on the anniversary of the Triangle Fire, and I'd been asked to go down to University of South Florida and give a talk, and I wanted to meet living wage Fight for 15 activists there. So I asked for a meeting, and we met at Teresita's Cuban Cafe in West Tampa, and I walked in, and at the table were fast food workers. The home health care workers had to Skype in because they worked so many hours a week they couldn't be there, right? So they Skyped in, and college professors. And I talked to the college professors, and I said, this is kind of an interesting working class solidarity, right? To have college professors organizing with home health care workers and fast food workers. And Keegan Shepard, who's a graduate student in history at the University of South Florida, where the adjuncts just won a union this week, said to me, they try to tell us that with our advanced degrees we're special, and if we just stay quiet and we're just good, we'll get those tenure track jobs, we'll get long-term contracts, we'll get benefits. He said, but that's a lie to keep us quiet, because the truth is we're all fast food workers now. And that's where the title of the book came. And so those two themes are the themes of the book that we found united people around the world. You know, one is this 100-year slide back in terms of rights, labor rights, in terms of safety conditions, in terms of what people's wages buy, in terms of the hours people work, right? And the other is what our friends who we interviewed in Manila in the Philippines call contractualization. Nobody's an employee anymore. Everybody is a contract worker. And as a contract worker, you make an end run around, again, these labor rights that were won in, you know, from 1900 to the 1930s. You don't get overtime. You don't get minimum wage. You're not, you know, you're not entitled to certain safety standards. So instead, it sounds really nice, the gig economy. It's really cheerful, right? This idea where, you know, this Labor Day, there was a piece about how all the young people today in the gig economy have a gig on the side. Yeah. Yes, they do. Yes, they do, because people can't live on what they make. The majority of American workers can't live on what they make. So these are the themes of the book, and in pursuit of understanding those better, we went around the world, and maybe Liz will tell you a little bit about what we did and some of the people we met whose images in Liz's amazing photographs are around the room, and I hope you'll get it up close and personal with them. People opened up their homes and hearts and union halls and meetings, and stopped to talk to us in the middle of protests. They really told us the story of these conditions around the world, some of which are devastating, but also this global movement to change conditions. And what Irma is your name? Enith said is absolutely right. There have been some huge victories in terms of bringing a living wage, and I think that those victories have been won only because of the incredible organizing that's going on around the world today by many of the very poorest workers. So let me move to Liz for a bit to tell the story of how we did this research, and then we'll come back.
I'd also like to say, if anybody has any questions, just feel free, pop in, shout out, feel free. We're from Brooklyn, as you know, so we're good with it. So one of the things I'm struck with when I look at the photos is that the enthusiasm. Everybody was so eager to share their stories, and we were obviously strangers. We were foreigners. We had some credentials, but we were invited into people's homes. And if I had chosen the selects differently, everybody would be smiling. it would just be a sea of smiles. And as it is, there are enough. But if you look in people's eyes, you'll also see this knowing. You know, you will see this really wanting to have their story be told. And if you look even deeper, you'll see suffering. Many of the stories we heard were really difficult. People talk a lot about the struggle. They talk a lot about the fight. And we hear a lot about the struggle, and we hear a lot about the fight. And sometimes those beautiful faces kind of belie the experience beneath it. But every one of the activists we met is absolutely, completely committed to change and to making a mark and passing. And we met so many mothers, so many moms who were fighting so that their children could have a better way of life. And $15 an hour won't go far if you're a single mom, but it'll go a lot farther than $11 an hour. And you might even get a little time off to spend some time with your kids. And that was another theme that we heard, which was that these are not just activists, but mothers as well, in many cases, and fathers as well. So, Annelise.
All right, I want to read you one story because this story is really interesting to me in that it took place down the road in Providence, but every reporter that I've spoken to about this story is so upset by it that the follow-up question always says, let's talk about that incident you mentioned that happened in the Philippines. So I want to give you, with the light. You talk for a second.
Okay, no, this is where I get my phone and I shine the lights. Are there any questions so far? Anybody have any thoughts? Yeah.
How come the movement settled at 15? Because I don't think that's adequate. I think 22, 25.
I think you're completely on trend. I don't know. Ina, do you want to take over for that?
Well, I think when SCIU started this, about 8 years ago, 15 was considered to be like pie in the sky. Yeah. And obviously, 15 is not a living wage today, and many places have gone beyond that. But when this started, which I think was about 8 or 9 years ago, minimum wage in this country for everybody else is about $7.25. So minimum wage, this represented double what was the minimum wage. And it sounded better than $20, and it sounded like something that could be winnable. And I know that in Massachusetts we did do polling on the first Raise Up initiative. So, it was not a perfect thing, but it was an agitational thing. And I would say it set a benchmark, and that's what organizing is. It sets a standard, but I think a lot of places have gone beyond it.
Did you find any sort of blowback on $15 an hour? Because where I'm from in New York, there was always people who say, why should a fast food worker get the same thing as a first responder? So, any thoughts on that?
When SCIU started this, this is your presentation.
Yeah, no, but we're going to open it up a little bit if we
When
can.
SCIU first started it, there was a lot of tension in the union because the union was putting a lot of money into something that is not, it's still controversial as to whether it's going to really bring dues in. Like it's 15 in a union, but it has not brought a dues dollar into the union. And so there was tension between existing members who were not making $15 an hour. Like we had in Massachusetts, our home care workers did not make 15, and our nursing home workers did not make 15. But what it really did was it challenged the union to say we need to bring everybody up to 15. So in Massachusetts, I can only speak for Massachusetts. In 1199, our view was no contract start rate is less than $15 an hour, and we had to spend a lot of political capital moving workers from making $11 an hour to 15, and that was a huge fight because every dollar you put to the bottom means your X-ray tech and your nurse does not get the money. So we had to do a lot of union building.
Yeah, I think one of the greatest victories in this struggle has been changing the mind of the American public, right? So when, people started talking about $15 an hour, the federal minimum wage had been stuck at $7.25, forever. And, it still is. And I think one of the victories when people ask me what has been won, the start is a lot of money. Is it enough? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. But between 2012 and 2016, low-wage workers in this country won for themselves $61.5 billion. That is 12 times what Congress gave them the last time Congress raised the minimum wage. So that's dramatic. And workers want it for themselves. They want it for themselves. And so LaFonza Butler, who was the co-chair of the LA Raise the Wage campaign, who we interviewed for this project, said, nobody's going to Vegas on $15 an hour. It's $31,000 a year. But it did seem delusional when people started talking just a few years ago about doubling the federal minimum wage. And she said the psychological benefits are huge. Because when you're trying to work, you know, and you can't support yourself on what you earn, it's crushing. Right? And so she said the psychological benefits of winning 15, and I mean in New York and California, the largest labor markets in the country, you know, in 2016 granted the $15 wage. Now, they're also two of the most expensive labor markets in the country, like this area, like Massachusetts. That said, and it's a phased-in wage, all of that. This group of workers, this movement, turned around a trend that had been stuck. Wages had been stagnant for 40 years. 40 years, and they're going up, right? So you know, when I talk about this project and people ask me how I have hope, because things are happening. They're happening a lot. And so I want to read you this one story about Santa Brito, who was one of the people who hunger struck on the steps of the Rhode Island State Capitol in the summer of 2014 because Providence had the ballot initiative for the $15 wage looked like it was going to be successful. And then Rhode Island legislature, which is controlled by Democrats, voted a preemption bill. Do you guys know what preemption bills are? Preemption bills were one of the tools of the Koch brothers, of ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council. They were introduced 1,000 times into state legislatures across the country between 2012 and 2016. And what they said is that a city or a municipality or a county can't have a higher minimum wage than the state. So Santa Brito was one of a group of people who sat on the steps of the Rhode Island State Capitol when Rhode Island was considering one of these preemption bills, which ultimately passed. And she was one of 4 hunger strikers. One of the others, there's Mirjam. Yeah, one of the others was Mirjam Parada, who's actually a union hotel cook, but decided to be out there with people who didn't earn enough. She was already earning $17 an hour because she's union. And they hunger struck, and they also tried to organize, and ultimately were successful in organizing their hotel. So this is Santa's story. Okay, right. All right. To organize, and this is another theme of this book, which is that global capitalism has made it so that people don't know who they're working for, right? So to organize, workers must first figure out who owns their hotel. That involves a fair amount of digging, and it can change in an instant. That is a common problem for 21st century unions. Whether it's garment factories or hotels, workers often don't know who profits from their labor. Usually it's not the same people who set their wages, but it is precisely these faceless investors whom workers must pressure if things are to improve. Santa Brito learned this the hard way. When Brito first arrived in Providence from the Dominican Republic, she was hired in a non-union housekeeping job at the Renaissance Hotel. The boss was decent. She said he was a human being. He treated us with care. Then the hotel changed hands. The new owners brought in the Procaccianti Group to manage. Procaccianti runs hotels for Marriott, Intercontinental, Wyndham, and other brands, providing, quote, management through the owner's lens. What this means, said Brito, is that they don't think of us as human beings. All they want is to torture our bodies, to wring everything out of us as if we are rags. Brutal disregard, she said, drove her into the arms of Unite Here, the Hotel and Restaurant Workers Union. And this, you know, I'll give you a spoiler as I tell you her story. They did eventually win, right? They did eventually unionize the Renaissance Hotel. But she said after the Procacciantis took over, they laid a lot of people off, then they cut wages for everyone else. The new supervisors were abusive, and they made us work so hard. The threat of firing was omnipresent, unspoken but omnipresent. So even after her daily quota was up to 18 rooms, okay, try to imagine making beds in 18 rooms, Brito didn't complain. They even stopped giving extra credit for checkouts, which take much longer than cleaning for guests who are staying. Brita says there were other hotels in Providence that she knew of where housekeepers had to clean, quote, 24 rooms a day. You can't work like that for long without getting hurt. When Brita became pregnant, she worried that the heavy workload might harm her baby or send her into labor early. Like most low-wage workers, and this is something that Edith just mentioned, who do not belong to unions, Brita did not have a single paid day off that she was entitled to in a year, not for illness, not for maternity leave. She said, I had to work. I needed to pay for my house, for my baby. She was afraid to ask, even for unpaid time off. I thought they'd fire me. Brita was changing bed linens when her contractions began. She asked to leave. Her shift supervisor said no. Her water broke, and Brita decided, I don't care. And she left. I went to the hospital to have my baby, still wearing my uniform. She says she barely had time to wash the toxic cleaning solvents from her hands. 2 weeks later, she was fired. As she hung up the phone, she realized if she didn't want to feel helpless, the only answer was to organize. And since that time, she has not stopped. So Santa is one of these stories that is very close to here. There's a story of hotel workers that's even closer to here, and that is the hotel workers at the Doubletree in Harvard Square, who were trying to unionize also back in 2014 when I started working on this project. And was anybody there for the demonstration they did? Do you remember it? Yeah. I'm talking about the bed-making demonstration. They did a bed-making demonstration. One of the other pieces of this project that I think is really important is to understand that as Blake Cattaman, who's there, the choreographer whose picture is over there from Manila, who organizes singing, dancing flash mobs of fast food workers to protest for a living wage. They block traffic and they sing and dance so the people won't get mad at them because they'll be entertained while the civil disobedience is going on. Anyway, what he said to us is, this is not your grandmother's revolution. And indeed it's not. And one of the things that workers have to do is they have to become visible. Most of these workers are invisible. That's the nature of global capitalism. You don't see Massimo Frattini, this Milanese organizer of global actions, said, it's a quote in the book, he said, you know, when people leave a hotel room and come back at the end of the day, they must think a fairy has come in. And he said, for us, getting people to understand that it's a human being and how hard this work is on their bodies is the first step, right? So what the hotel workers in Harvard Square did, because Harvard wouldn't settle and they wouldn't press the Doubletree to settle, is they brought these beds out into Harvard Square and they showed students and faculty and people who worked for the university as they went by how to make a bed the way that their bosses demanded that this bed be made, right? And people were really struggling, and it was really hurting their bodies, and it was really hurting their backs. And they said, okay, so now imagine doing this 18, 20 rooms a day. And the bed-making demonstration was really great. Eventually, they settled, they won a contract a couple of years later. But that gives you a sense of the kinds of struggles that are going on worldwide. To move out of Providence and Boston and this area and go to where we did, we saw some things that were deeply shocking and make up another part of the book. And I wonder if, Liz, if you want to talk about Manila.
Has anybody been to Manila? Anybody from the Philippines? Okay. Anybody who's from the Philippines will tell you that it's one of the most beautiful countries that you've ever seen, with some of the most beautiful beaches that you've ever seen. But we did not go there. That will have to be for the sequel. But we did go to some of the worst slums that we've ever seen. Mostly we interviewed people in sort of proper offices, and Annelise can talk about that, but we did spend some time in a place called Happy Land, which is in Metro Manila, and it's a slum. And it's also called the Tondo Slum, and it's also called Smoky Mountain. And this was a landfill at one point, and it is where all the refuse, all the garbage, everything in Manila ends up. And many thousands and thousands of people live there and pick through those discarded items and try to sell them for very, very, very meager wages. Some of the pictures here, there's garlic peelers, women who sat in this incredibly dank and wet room peeling garlic day in and day out. People are struggling to make a living. There's a photo toward the back. It's called the Pog Pog. Pog Pog is it's a food that is made from discarded restaurant scraps and things that cling to the bottom of like fast food containers, and it goes into a stew there. So one of the cautions in doing this kind of work as a photographer is to be incredibly sensitive to issues of privilege and the fact that we get to go home and we didn't have to stay, and people there did. So I just think it's worth mentioning that we are, to whatever extent possible, mindful of that, and we were certainly mindful when we were there. We left Happy Land and we went to our hotel, and really try to just be aware of the privileges that we have in this country, and certainly not exploit people, and certainly not exploit their stories. But we also feel that these are stories that should be told, and these are pictures that should be seen. We did a show back in my home turf of Rhinebeck, New York, and at a library there, and we put the pictures up, and no sooner had the pictures gone up than a guy talked to the program director at the library and she said something like, "Do you like the pictures?" And he said, "Yeah, but I think you should have pictures of the presidents. Why don't you have pictures of the presidents?" And a friend said, "Okay, the president of Bangladesh, the president of the Philippines." But what I wanted people to know was that we didn't make these stories up. This is real, and if you choose to turn away, you turn away. But if you choose to look, you're going to see something real. So that's a little bit about the Philippines.
So I wanted to talk about Manila, read a little piece from that to give you a sense, because you'll see pictures of these what they call danger zones in Manila, which is where the people live literally below sea level. And what we found there is something that I've found throughout my career, which is the answer to the lie that poor people are poor because they don't work hard. We saw no one there who wasn't working. And working in every kind of way, this recycling fast food waste into Pog Pog, right, for people to eat in the community, this peeling mountains of garlic, right, which served all the restaurants in the city. But from that neighborhood also come these kids, because one of the other pieces of the global economy now is a young labor force. Yes?
Sorry,
No, please, dig in.
When you hold your phone like that,
Oh gosh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. It's just I'm old and I didn't bring reading glasses. Okay, so this little piece gives you a sense of this not your grandmother's revolution, this new kind of protest. This little chapter is called Respect, Let It Go, 'Cause Baby, You're a Firework. You might recognize that those are riffs on song titles. And these kids are, this is their protest. It's a steamy dawn in downtown Manila, already hot though it's only 6:30. A group of slim young men and women in their teens and 20s file out into the middle of a busy avenue wearing white shirts, black pants, and purple headbands. The strains of Katy Perry's Firework rise from the boombox, heavy on the bass. At other times, they dance to Aretha Franklin's Respect or the Disney theme Let It Go from the movie Frozen. But this is a morning for fireworks. The kids start to dance with verve as perfectly synchronized as a Broadway chorus line. They sing as they move, improvising as they go, riffing on Katy Perry's lyrics in a mix of Tagalog and English, igniting the light inside them, letting it shine, showing the world what they are worth. I had to paraphrase for the press because they didn't want to buy the rights to the lyrics. They shout, strike poses, pump fists, because baby, we are fireworks. Cars roar in from all directions. Drivers honk or tap their fingers through open windows. Motorcycles grind to a halt. Some yell at the dancers to move, others sing along. Then comes the chant, what do we want? Decent jobs. Again and again to the beat of the song. Decent jobs for all. It can take forever to get anywhere in Metro Manila. One of the world's most densely populated cities, it is also vast. In 2016, it had 13 million people, 23 million if you count suburbs and ring towns. The city center is choked by sprawling, smoky slums that are home to young activists in the RESPECT Fast Food Workers Alliance. And respect is the other theme of this story. Everywhere I went, people said wages are important, respect is more important. So this group is called RESPECT, the Philippine Fast Food Workers Union. The organization United for Respect at Walmart, our Walmart, is the main organization of Walmart workers in the United States. Okay, the poorest among them come from what Joanna Bernice Carnation, who's otherwise known as Sister Nice, she's an organizer, calls danger zones, where tin and cardboard shacks sit below sea level, flooding every time the inevitable rains and typhoons hit. It's a world of mud and sewage, but also of song and dance. Many of the best performers come from a neighborhood called Bagang Silangan, a barangay, Tagalog for neighborhood, known for high unemployment and excellent dancers, says Leigh Catamon, a 23-year-old choreographer and theater student and labor organizer. When Carnation and Catamon realized that poor kids were entering dance contests to make money for their families, to supplement their inadequate wages, they helped them create a union, the Dancers Union of Bagang Silangan, otherwise known as Dubs. The name is an allusion to a globally popular genre of electronic dance music that grew out of reggae, hip-hop, and techno. Much of the Philippine workforce is under 30, and jobs are increasingly precarious. Using young dancers to lead labor protests drew attention to their issues, Catamon says. I was totally nervous my first time to dance in the street, said Dubs member Irene Rimental, but seeing all the people stopped on the overpass and the vehicles watching us, at that moment I felt joy. Dancing for a cause feels great, said one 19-year-old male Dubs member. Before, I only danced to brag. Now with Dubs, I dance for a purpose. Decent and secure jobs, upholding women's rights. These issues have impact on my and my family's lives. So what they do is they go around the country training these kids who are fast food workers to look at issues like wage theft, right? And sexual violence is another big issue that's driving this organizing, because the majority of low-wage workers around the world are women. And they do these sessions for young people in this country where half the labor force is under 30. And then they wanted to say, how do you have a young people's movement? So Catamon said, we started doing flash mobs to appeal to young people. Instead of carrying protest signs, same old, we perform. When people start to listen, clap their hands, maybe sing along, we know we are succeeding. The young dancers all understand that we are not performing for the sake of performance alone, but for a larger purpose. So though music has been part of many movements, obviously, protest songs, 60s, very famous, Manila has become this place where you're constantly seeing scenes that appear to have been ripped out of Glee or other television musicals, where suddenly people start, drifting into the middle of traffic or into the middle of malls, pulling off their shirts to reveal shirts underneath, dancing in unison. On May 14th, 2014, which was a day of global action by fast food workers in 40 countries, 6 continents, teenage fast food workers line danced their way through Manila, singing to the music from Disney's animated hit Frozen. Singing loudly, they urged fellow workers, let it go, don't hold back anymore, let it go, turn away, slam the door. They made up lyrics as they danced, holding hands, they pulled workers from behind counters and into the streets, into the strike. They sang about rising as a new dawn broke, and they celebrated the end of fear. Here I stand in the light of day, they sang. If that brought a raging storm, that was fine. McDonald's never bothered me anyway. So flash mobs are a signature of the Philippine labor movement. On International Women's Day 2015, March 8th, 5,000 women trade unionists danced in front of Manila's Malacanang Presidential Palace, singing Helen Reddy's 1972 hit, I Am Woman. They love 1970s American R&B. The theme song of this movement is 1970s American R&B. 1 year later, men danced wearing women's shoes because walk a day in my shoes is a slogan of the low-wage worker struggle everywhere. And during the 2016 Global Week of Action by hotel housekeepers, Dubs dancers made the march a chorus line as hotel workers sang in unison, women's voices can shake the world. Respect's best-known musical dance is the Aretha Franklin 1967 mega hit for which the group is named. It is Lake Cattleman's favorite. He breaks into dance, demonstrating his flashiest moves, breathing hard, he chants, R-E-S-P-E-C-T, I'll tell you what it means to me. Dancing and running, then he freezes with his fist raised. He looks up and shouts, respect. It's not as easily quantified as a living wage, but it's crucial. And maybe you want to talk about taking some of those pictures of Lay. Oh, yeah. Yeah, maybe show some of the.
Should I just put it on the loop, or do you want to?
Yeah.
If you want to just go to the next one, if you want to go to the first one, we can introduce you to some of the characters in the book now. Okay, thank you. Yeah.
What? Go ahead.
So the first picture, these are the pictures that actually appear in the book, the black and white images. This is Blue Rayner, and this photograph was taken at the fight, I think it was April 4/15. Yeah, it was 4/15, April in 2015. In New York City, and what Blue is doing here is he is showing you the burns on his arms. And Annelise, why don't you, this is how the book starts, so.
In the summer of 2015, Blue opened his mail. He's a 26-year-old fast food worker in Tampa, and he opened his mail and he found an invitation from the Human Rights Commission of the Brazil Senate, the federal Senate in Brazil, asking him to come to Rio to testify, and to Brasilia, to testify about conditions for fast food workers in the United States. What had happened is that Brazilian fast food workers for Arcos Dourados, Golden Arches, the Brazilian McDonald's affiliate, had been organizing, and McDonald's was the second largest employer in Brazil. It is also the second largest private employer in the world. And the only largest private employer is, what do you think? Walmart. And the only employers, period, on the planet bigger than Walmart and McDonald's are the United States and Chinese militaries. What the Brazilian Senate decided is that companies like McDonald's weren't just affecting wages and working conditions for fast food workers in Brazil and around the world. They were affecting wages and working conditions for everybody, everywhere. So they invited fast food workers and low-wage workers from around the world to come and testify, and much to Blue's surprise, he opened his mail and found this invitation, and he got to this event, and he met these guys who were fast food workers in other parts of the world, and they rolled up their sleeves. And what you see there is a series of stripes, they're burns. And in this moment that gave him chills, this guy from Japan, McDonald's worker from Japan, rolled up his sleeves, and they put their arms together, and they had the stripes on exactly the same parts of their arms. And then Benedict Murillo from Manila rolled up his sleeve, and he had stripes in exactly the same places on their arms. And when we went to interview the Respect people, and Liz has got a photograph of this, although it's not here, they put their arms together, they all rolled up their sleeves in, but put their arms together like spokes in a wheel on the table, and they all had the same burns in the same places. So that's one way to learn about global capitalism, right? They all have to turn around orders in 90 seconds. They all have to reach across burning oil to do it, right? McDonald's has standards, that they impose on franchisees. They can say all they want that the franchisees are the real bosses. McDonald's corporate is the real bosses, and here they had their evidence, which is the burns on their arms. Before Liz goes on to talk about the other pictures, you can see he's wearing an I Can't Breathe sweatshirt, and that's really important. I Can't Breathe was the last words that were spoken by Eric Garner, a street vendor in Staten Island, before he was suffocated by the NYPD. And a lot of the folks who marched that day in the Fight for 15 march were wearing I Can't Breathe shirts. And so, as Blue put it, he said, we're the same people. So we're the people who get harassed and shot at by the cops on our way home from work. So this movement there are many ways in which these movements overlap, but the movement of low-wage workers absolutely overlaps with Black Lives Matter and the fight against police violence.
Okay, so when we went to Cambodia, we were allowed into a lot of workplaces to hear stories from workers representing the garment trades. We met sex workers. We met a lot of different organizers. Annelise, why don't you talk about this particular?
Chim Sitar and Pao Chumoni organized a union of 4,000 hotel workers on this little island in the middle of the Mekong and Tonle Sap rivers in downtown Phnom Penh, which had been this really nice park that people could go to, and it was home to hundreds of fishing families up until around 2010. One of the things about this book is that it is so recent. So many of the things we're talking about took place so recently. Anyway, Hun Sen, the Hun Sen regime, when pressured to be more democratic by the United States, what that really meant to them was to let in more global capital. And so Diamond Island, where these young women work, went from being a fishing village and a public park to this place that wouldn't be out of place in Las Vegas. It's got these modern casinos and, you know, and sort of the same sort of Vegas fake, you know, plaster of Paris, Cambodian villages, and people come from around the world to these casinos. And these folks, they struck in this amazing strike where they were compared. Interestingly, people started calling them Norma Ray. Now that's really fascinating because they didn't have a clue who Norma Ray was. But they decided to find out, and they were very interested to find out that, of course, Norma Ray was a fictional character based on real-life organizers in a 1970s textile strike at the J.P. Stevens mill in the American South. And so they started teaching the other workers in the hotel the history of that story. They watched the movie. They learned about Norma Ray. And they were able to organize in the midst of, you know, in the face of a very, very repressive regime and one that will not hesitate to use violence. They were able to organize a union of 3,000 to 4,000 members who are these hotel housekeepers. And it was a scary thing to do. And Chim Sitar, who's 27 in the striped shirt, talked about the significance of having a union that was led by women and that was made up of women members in a country where there are very, very few women union leaders. And one of the things we talked about was whether or not it might cost her her life. And she was one of a number of people, including some of the Filipinos we organized who are facing off against the Duterte regime, who said, I know I could die. And she said, that's really okay. This is work that has to be done. And Che Moni, who's a garment union organizer, who you see there, explained why. He said, because after the Khmer Rouge, we deserve a real democracy. And whatever it takes to get it, we will do. You'll see behind them is the banner of the Global Housekeepers movement. They, like domestic workers we met, like fast food workers we met, they go to international conferences, often paid for by SEIU and other big international unions, and meet their counterparts from other parts of the world, right? And so they were, at the moment that we met them, not just organizing this incredible union, but trying to establish global labor standards for housekeepers across Asia. They believed it was doable, right, to try to create these kinds of standards. I wanted you to wrap your brain around it. You know, this 27-year-old. These are very, very impressive people.
Kalpona actor Annelise mentions Kalpona. This photograph was taken in Montreal. Singularly impressive, passionate woman who told us stories that were absolutely hair-raising about her experience in Bangladesh. Picking through the burnt-out ruins of a factory after there had been a fire. This was not the Rana Plaza fire, but this was another fire. And she was determined to go in to collect evidence. And the evidence she collected in this burnt-out factory were labels from all the global brands that were manufacturing clothing in that factory, and that included H&M, The Gap, probably many others I'm forgetting, Walmart, Children's Place. So, you know,
she was there at the World Social Forum in Montreal, which is kind of the it's the counter organizing that goes on in the face of the World Economic Forum, right? These are all the social justice groups from around the world who meet to try to come up with strategies. And Kalpona actor, who started working when fast fashion began in the 1980s, she was 12 years old. and she had a family to support because both her parents were sick, so she had 5 siblings she had to support. And she and her 10-year-old brother went to work in these shops, and they were working sometimes, you know, she said they would keep us in the shop sometimes 3 weeks at a time. She decided when the 100th anniversary of the Triangle Fire was coming up, she and other activists thought this is a really good moment to make clear that people are working under conditions from 100 years ago. And so she started traveling around the world talking about the conditions that workers faced. And she has had remarkable success in doing so.
We'll move through a little bit quicker. This is Maria Elena de Rosa. Annelise can also tell you a little bit about her history. This photograph was taken in downtown Los Angeles. It was 100 degrees. It was not fun schlepping the camera around, I will tell you that, but you know, she's a remarkable person and has an incredible history.
Maria Elena is one of the main hotel organizers. Grew up as a farm worker, and she was in the United Farm Workers Union. And one of the things that she made clear is that the spirit of the United Farm Workers lives in both the SEIU and Unite Here organizers, who are really driving this living wage campaign. And in particular, they talked about it, and people in other parts of the world talked about what they called social movement unionism. Not old-fashioned bread and butter unionism, but unionism that's a movement and that creates community, and it's not all kids. You know, she laughed when I said this seems to come out of nowhere, right? It's been going on for a very long time, and you have a lot of these young people, and you also have veterans like Maria Elena who have been, you know, at it since the 1970s.
Okay, this is Sister Nice Coronacion, and this was taken in Manila. Annelise has mentioned Sister Nice before, but I think you could see here again, as we were talking, as I was mentioning a little bit earlier, these incredible smiles and what animates people to go out and do this work. She's a great example, tireless, energetic, enthusiastic. Anything to add on Sister Nice, or should we?
Well, one of the things Sister Nice made very clear is how many of these activists think of this as a women's movement. She uttered a line that became a title of one of the chapters and that cracked me up. She very seriously said, you can't dismantle capitalism without dismantling patriarchy. So she had her work to do. At 27, she was determined to do it. And so this is also, she made clear the extent to which this is a global women's movement. And she's part of a group called the World March of Women that has been organizing thousands of women activists around the world since 1995, started in Quebec, and from Congo to Kigali to Morocco to Turkey. They brought seeds to women in refugee camps from Syria, from the Syrian conflict, so that's the other piece of this, is this women's movement. It's not simply a union movement, but a women's movement of workers and women peace activists fighting what they, you know, these twin evils of neoliberalism and patriarchy.
I think somebody mentioned, even maybe it was you, home care workers and healthcare workers. If you live in New York City, as I do, or even here possibly, this is a really forgotten class, typically of women, many women of color, many women from the islands, through unionizing, through activism, these women are actually getting a voice and drawing attention to the work they do, the incredibly hard work they do, you know, sometimes working 20 hours a day. You know, if they work for somebody elderly, they can't leave. You know, if somebody doesn't come for the next shift, they're staying.
Yeah. Fight for 15, as one of them pointed out to me, for them is a 15-minute break in an otherwise 24-hour day.
So, respect. We all deserve respect. This was on a street corner in the Upper West Side of Manhattan. You know, Annelise has talked about this as being a young person's movement. Certainly, it feels like a young person's movement. Yesterday, I think it was yesterday, was Walkout Day. I hope you all saw as many incredible videos as I did. You know, I hope you were as moved as I was to see young people walking out and speaking out, and how incredibly articulate they were. And this is not necessarily the youngest group of people, but this was a gathering with a lot of students from, you know, high schools in New York who were on their way to jobs in fast food.
I'm good. Keep going. Yeah, one of the things that this movement has done very successfully is subvert expensive advertising slogans. They've done a ton of stuff with Not Lovin' It, which the McDonald's paid Justin Timberlake $6 million to sing that. It was the first global TV ad campaign. So Not Lovin' It has been one of the slogans of the movement. Walmart has their pay less, live better. They've done sit down, live better when they have had the first sit down strike in a Walmart since the 1937 Woolworth strikes. You get the basic idea.
And this is Leigh Catamon, taken on the street in Metro Manila. And again, Annelise has talked about him as being this very enthusiastic and very animated guy, very committed to the cause as well. And he has also talked about what he would be doing if he wasn't doing this. What kind of job would he be doing? And so his sense of self, his self-confidence, and his sense of status in his family as well has gone way up through this work. He is the dancer. That is yes, he is the dancer. Yes. Okay, Prince and Canute. We love these guys. These are New York City airport workers. Again, another group of people, baggage handlers, and people who call your taxi at New York City airports, who were not for this movement, would continue to be grossly underpaid.
Prince and Canute are interesting because they're part of a movement that has brought people into unions. In the fall of 2016, they won a union for 8,000 airport workers in JFK, LaGuardia, and Newark airports, and they were part of a nationwide successful union drive in 19 of the country's largest airports. So there have been, this criticism that you mentioned, Eunice, about how this movement hasn't brought people into unions. That's starting to change. And one of the things Prince and Canute made me aware of is he said, we were inspired by the fast food workers. They're younger members of our own families, by and large. And so, we then went out and they are now going global as well. Their balloon says poverty doesn't fly. And this movement had, again, Maria Elena Durazo was hunger striking to unionize LAX back in the 1990s. This movement's been going on for about 20 years, and I think in part as a result of the attention that the fast food workers and the Fight for 15 have drawn, they've been able to successfully bring people into unions.
Okay, Denise and Venanzi. Some of these are like our greatest hits. We sort of have our iconic shots. And so this is one of our, right, Annelise? It's kind of one of our iconic shots. So Denise and Venanzi are our Walmart activists. And this photo was taken in Pico Rivera, California. And I think it's important, Annelise will tell you a little something about what brought them to this work.
These two women organized the first strike against the Walmart on American soil in the United States. In 2012, and they were the people who, some people say the fast food workers kicked off the movement. They would like to say that they were a couple of days earlier with the Black Friday protest, Black Friday, the biggest shopping day of the year, and they walked out and terrified themselves because they had no idea who'd be walking behind. And as one of their mentors, Evelyn Cruz, who also worked, they worked in the Pico Rivera Walmart, this little dusty Latinx working class suburb outside LA, as one of their mentors said, Walmart there and everywhere else engages in what she calls predatory hiring. They hire people who they can abuse. Right? They hire people who've been cut off welfare. They hire people who are single moms. They hire ex-cons. They hire disabled people. They hire people who they know can't fight back. So it was scary when they walked out for the first time. But this very interesting thing happened, which is a bus rolled up of Walmart workers from around the world. And again, this is where the money that the unions have had, the big international unions, has made a difference. And they were walked back in at the end of the strike. They were walked back into the store by these Walmart workers from Uruguay and from Italy and from South Africa who showed up in this bus, and they're singing union songs and marching them back into this Pico Rivera Walmart. Of course, security came and tried to throw them out. And they said nobody but Walmart employees can be inside the store, and they pulled out their Walmart employee cards, and they said very loudly so that so the workers could hear. In other countries, Walmart workers have unionized, right? And so here's our Walmart workers card, here's our union card. So they have remained active. Denise, many of our Walmart activists have lost their jobs. Almost everybody we interviewed has been fired. Walmart has lost again and again in the National Labor Relations Board. They have been sanctioned. They've been ordered to rehire people. They've been ordered to stop penalizing workers. It is against the law to penalize workers for organizing. But in the end, people pay a price. And sometimes that price is homelessness. Peter Dreyer, who's a really wonderful scholar of poverty in this current age, just released a report with a bunch of other people that found that 10% of Disneyland employees currently are homeless. So the story that they tell, they're continuing to work and organize and try to get paid leave, but they pay a price.
And this is the price. This is Jenny Mills, and that's her car. And she lives in that car, or she was at that time. I'm not sure where she is now. Maybe Annelise knows, but that car was parked in front of a fast food place in the parking lot of the Pico Rivera Walmart, which had closed under mysterious circumstances after this effort to organize. Jenny lived in that car with her husband and her cat, and for 2 years. And she's not alone. Not alone. Okay. Shrepan is somebody we met in Phnom Penh, and it's hard to describe the conditions under which people live when they leave their villages and go into sort of worker housing, these sort of dormitories, how tiny they are and how dark they are and how difficult it is. But as you can see, a huge smile on her face.
Yeah, one of the stories of the book is people being forced off their land, and that's part of the story of this moment, is this mass dispossession. These are the folks who come rushing into the cities, whether it's Manila or Phnom Penh, to do the work to make our clothes. And she is a union organizer. This is the kind of rooms that garment workers live in. But she's a union president and has had some real success in her organizing.
Okay, this is also, it talked a little bit about going in and seeing how well people are organized. We use that word organizing to sort of describe the activity, but the fact is that despite, incredible odds, change is happening, and a lot of people are becoming sort of inspired to join unions, to join organizing efforts.
Yeah, these are hotel workers. Again, a lot of them actually were organizing workers for vacation rentals, something we never think about, right? Who cleans the vacation rentals? And they're actually trying to create a union of the people who clean those. It's getting late. Should we?